Welcome. I wanted to give you a bit of an overview for this week, and we'll begin. So when we're defining typical development, a lot of folks say, what's typical? Because no one is exactly average at everything or even anything most of the time, and that is true. So it's differences among children, or among all of us, that are a matter of degree. So each child will fall somewhere along a continuum. If you're going to have a big line of, here's a ton of skills, here's very little, or here's very far ahead academically, and here's very far behind, and everyone's going to be on that continuum. So we're looking at the degree of difference. So each child falls somewhere along that continuum, having very few skills or very advanced skills in each domain. And each area of development we can look at would include physical, cognitive, or mental, and then social, emotional. So it varies by child. If this is average, and this is a little above average, and this is a little below average, or maybe we flip that around. I might be a little ahead in reading, a little behind in math, but it's in that range. For some of you that are more familiar with statistics or know the bell curve, typically we're looking at 2 standard deviations or more above or below the mean when we're looking at some really advanced standardized tests, some academic and social and cognitive assessments that maybe psychologists, therapists, and others have used, medical professionals as well, to make these diagnoses, okay? So everyone has some differences, but when we move far away from typical, and that's why it's so important to know about child development and what is kind of average, knowing that there's a wide range for everybody, but sometimes when we're moving far enough outside of that average, we're talking about a true medical or diagnostic exceptionality. I wanted to talk for one moment about your assignment for this week. There are case studies that are written based on real children that have been worked with. And I think it's so much more helpful to learn about these exceptionalities and learn about some of the things we're studying in class by studying the case studies. So you're reading chapters 4, 5, and 6. You're looking at the case studies in those chapters, and you're answering about a half a page to a page per case study. So it ends up being 1.5 to 3 pages total. Don't worry about going more than 3 pages. That is absolutely no problem at all. I would worry about going less than 1.5 pages just because it's unlikely that you'd be able to answer the questions thoroughly enough in such a short span. So don't over worry on that piece. We're going to move into our lecture for this week now. And we're going to talk about what normal or typical development is. So there's a sequence. Children learn particular skills in a sequence. So when you're studying child development, which most of you have had before this class, a few of you might be taking concurrently, you know kind of what would be expected in terms of, first words, social skills, being able to hop on one foot, being able to crawl, walk, all of those things. There's a sequence. And based on their age, we should know what skills they're going to acquire next and approximately when that's going to be within a wide range of what we would consider typical. And then the milestones. So what does that look like? So a lot of you are already familiar with the ASQ, or the Ages and Stages questionnaire. That's another helpful guide. You can Google online and look up what types of things you're looking, or what types of skills we're looking for children at different ages. What would be considered atypical or exceptional development includes a wide variety of things. So we're going to look at a few different categories here, but developmental disabilities or delays. The child's unable to perform like their typically developing peers, but they still, of course, always have the potential for growth. So a lot of times we might be looking at a child who is performing like a child who's much younger than their age. So that could be physically, cognitively, or socially, where we think, what I would expect at 3 years old, this is looking more like the 2-year-olds that I work with, for instance. There's many reasons why a child may be diagnosed with an exceptionality. There are biological factors. So one could have to do with genetics or the parents. Another could have to do with particular birth defects or chromosomal abnormalities, heart defects, lots of things biologically that can happen, and some disabilities that run in families. So that's where it's very helpful to know some about family histories. And then environmental risks. Certainly in utero when a mother is pregnant. Drugs or alcohol can have an impact. Extreme poverty, lack of adequate nutrition, child abuse and neglect, all of these things can cause disabilities. So how are children diagnosed? Well, there is a variety of categories of disability under your text talks about IDEIA. We typically still say IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? That is where you hear about students being on IEPs and other special education laws protecting them. One is a specific learning disability. So this is a disorder, psychological processes involved in language, spoken or written. Some of these things are looked at, and this might happen with a little bit older students, processing disorders that include dyslexia, struggles with reading, writing, math, right? Typically in early childhood until they're moving into those upper grades, say first, second, third, that we would possibly be looking at that more. Speech and language disorders, that's a common disability category out of the disability categories that children end up with. So that could be receptive, them being able to understand what others are saying, or often expressive. So that could include things like not speaking much at all, having less vocabulary than we would expect, having articulation difficulties where they are hard to understand or comprehend. We know for all disabilities, by the way, it's not a general rule is the earlier we catch a disability and start services, the better, right? So early intervention is key. And you are all in a position where you might be the first one letting families know that there's a possible area of struggle that needs to be followed up with. Other categories include developmental delays. That's what it sounds like. So being behind. This is a common thing that's looked at. So a lot of times children may not have an official disability label like they may if they're older, but they just say, this child is just performing behind where we want them to be. We're going to get them the specialized services that they need, get them a plan, and see what we can do. An intellectual disability is essentially years ago what might have been called mental retardation, or sometimes in Colorado we called it a developmental disability. You can see how confusing that is because it sounds a lot like developmental delay. So nowadays when we talk about an intellectual disability, we're talking about what years ago was called mental retardation, where just remember here's that average. And then when we think about children that are very gifted, we're usually talking about when they do cognitive tests, memory tests, vocabulary tests, IQ types of tests. Giftedness is out in that top 3%, so way far out, and intellectual disability is way far out in roughly that bottom 3% of all children in terms of how their cognitive functioning is. And then emotional disturbances, so that could be severe behavioral or emotional responses, and this is important that it's different, significantly statistically different than their age or community would be expected or would be considered normal. I can tell you that this is a very rare label that would be used for children so young. And I've seen lots of teachers in early childhood in particular that very much want to say, oh, right, this child has a severe emotional disturbance or has autism or has whatever. Number one, of course, we would never, with our background and training, we're never diagnosing a child. We are expressing in particular specific ways any areas of real concern and being very specific with examples of that and not diagnosing. Second, many children are going to act out significantly if there's anything happening at home or otherwise that are causing disturbances for them. So, for instance, I worked with someone recently where they were very adamant that this child had an emotional disturbance. Well, when we talked further, I found out that mother had just abandoned family, couple family members were dying, dad was having drug and alcohol issues, and I had to tell them, stop. We cannot, number one, we don't want to make those diagnoses ourselves. Number two, when there is that much chaos in a child's life and they're that little, it's not going to look like they're doing well regardless. My son just wanted to say hi for half a moment. We are visiting his grandparents in Minnesota, so here he is.
Hello, world.
All right. You say goodbye for now?
Bye.
Bye. All right, so moving right along. The other things that we might see, multiple disabilities, which is what it sounds like. You certainly can have, it's not uncommon to have more than one disability. Hearing impairment. The next slide is going to also say vision impairments or deafness or blindness. One thing I want to make clear is a lot of times people say, well, they're not deaf or they're not blind. They can see some. Typically, even for someone that is diagnosed as being deaf or blind, they see or hear something. It's just legally and in many ways they're not able to function the way others have been. So don't be surprised if you think, how is this person deaf? I know that they can hear some, or I know that they can see some. It's not a total silence or a total darkness, typically. And then there are children that have a loss of both vision and hearing. We're learning more and more nowadays about autism. And that's, we used to call it Asperger's sometimes when it had a less significant level of, or a less disabling effect versus autism. Now we talk about autism spectrum disorder. And typically we're talking about impaired social functioning. So really some pretty distinct social struggles. We're going to be talking about it more coming up here, so I'm not going to go into great detail now, but this is something that that certainly will impact some students that you work with. And then traumatic brain injuries. So there's many things that can happen behaviorally and cognitively and socially if a child has had a brain injury. And that can take any number of effects. There are children that are both gifted and disabled. That is called 2E or twice exceptional. So people are sometimes shocked and they say, well, how can this child be gifted when they're hearing impaired or when they have autism? They absolutely can, and it's not uncommon. So just know that a child can be gifted, and typically when we talk about gifted, we're talking about a very high IQ on some of those tests that are given by a psychologist. A lot of times exceptional memory, very large vocabulary, quicker rate of learning, quicker rate of reading. Those are all common characteristics of children that are identified gifted. And they can also have a disability at the same time. We need to make sure that we're recognizing their gifts and not just their disabilities. Final thought on categories. So when we think about these categories, one, they change over time. So that might surprise you or surprise some people. I think it's important to know, though, that these categories can and do change over time based on laws, based on what we know. I mentioned that autism used to be called Asperger's and autism. Now we call it autism spectrum. I mentioned that intellectual disability we used to refer to as mental retardation. So these terms change and even the categories change. So I remember back 15, 20 years ago, autism was not part of the disabilities that were looked at on IEPs or under IDEA. Now it is. So these things do change based on laws, based on what we know. To meet a definition of one of these categories, their educational performance has to be adversely affected by the disability. So they're looking at how a child does in comparison to other children. And remember, we call it FAPE, free and appropriate public education. We say, can this child have a reasonable educational benefit in the general classroom? And if not, what types of services, right, in order for them to have an appropriate education, what types of services do they need? So we're looking at very particular assessments that are given by trained professionals. We're looking at very particular cutoffs of how they score in order to get this categorization. And we have documentation that they are being adversely affected due to this. It does not say what services there are, so that's something that a team of individuals comes together again with to decide what those services are, who they work with, and how often they work with them. But it is part of that process. I hope this was a good introduction. I look forward to working with you more this week, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.